The snow was falling again. Not gently as it did in the German countryside he once called home, but hard and relentless, driven sideways by the wind that swept through the broken streets of Stalingrad. It was February 2nd, 1943, the day the guns fell silent and the great German Sixth Army ceased to exist. In the ruins of the Red October factory, in cellars beneath what had once been houses, among bodies frozen where they fell, the survivors waited. Some for orders, some for food. Most simply for the end. The Battle of Stalingrad had lasted 200 days and 200 nights. It had begun in the blazing heat of August 1942, when Hitler's legions swept across the steppe toward the Volga. It ended here, in a world turned white with frost, where men no longer fought for glory, only for warmth, for bread, for another breath. Among them was a 23-year-old infantryman from Württemberg. His name is lost to time, but his words were not. On a scrap of field stationery, half burned at the edges, he wrote a final letter. To his mother, to his fiancée, perhaps to no one at all. It was found months later, frozen in his coat pocket. The ink had bled into the paper, but the first line remained clear. My dearest, the cold has become a living thing. It eats through us, and we no longer feel our hands. But I must write you, before the snow covers everything. When the German Sixth Army had first crossed the Don River in the summer of 1942, confidence was absolute. Stalingrad, Stalin's city on the Volga, was more than a target. It was a symbol. To take it would mean cutting Soviet Russia in half, securing the oil of the Caucasus, and delivering a blow so devastating that, in Hitler's words, the enemy would never recover. The soldiers believed him. They sang on the trains that carried them east. They painted names on their tanks: Greta, Lieselot, Iron Annie. They wrote home about sunflowers, about endless plains, about a land that seemed to have no end. But when they reached Stalingrad in late August, the illusion shattered. The Luftwaffe's bombing had turned the city into a furnace. Streets were reduced to gravel, buildings to skeletons of steel and brick. And from every cellar, every ruined stairwell, Soviet soldiers emerged to fight them. Men and women both, many barely older than children. By October, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a maze of rubble. The Germans advanced meter by meter, often losing ground by nightfall. One soldier described it as a sewer of smoke and ghosts. The Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, fought on. The Soviets would not yield. Stalin's order was simple: not one step back. By November, the Germans controlled most of the city. Their flag hung over the tractor factory, yet the victory they believed was within reach was already turning to dust. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army struck back in an operation named Uranus. From the north and south, Soviet forces encircled Stalingrad. Within days, 300,000 Axis troops were trapped. Hitler forbade retreat. The Sixth Army will stand fast, he declared. Stalingrad must be held at all costs. At first, the soldiers believed the airlift would save them. Goering promised that the Luftwaffe could deliver 300 tons of supplies a day. In reality, it managed barely a tenth of that. Soon the bread ran out. Fuel froze in its drums. Horses were slaughtered for meat, and the men began to die. Not from bullets, but from hunger and the cold. One officer wrote, "We no longer bury the dead. The ground is too hard and there are too many. We stack them in the ruins and mark the place with helmets." By January 1943, the ring had tightened. Soviet artillery bombarded what remained of the German lines day and night. Paulus radioed Hitler for permission to surrender. The answer came back, cold as the steppe wind. Capitulation is impossible. The Sixth Army obeyed. It had always obeyed. And yet, in the shadows of those frozen streets, obedience no longer mattered. Men huddled together in holes and burned their last letters for warmth. Others scribbled notes they knew would never be sent. Our unknown soldier, the one whose letter was later found, wrote by the light of a dying candle. He wrote not of victory, not of glory, but of longing. It is strange, Moody, how clear everything becomes when one knows it will soon end. I think often of our garden, of the little path behind the barn. I dream of the smell of bread. Tell Father I am not afraid. Only cold, When the Soviets entered the final German positions on February 2nd, there was little left to conquer. Paulus, newly promoted to field marshal by Hitler the day before, a cruel gesture meant to remind him that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, gave the order anyway. The battle was over. The once proud Sixth Army was gone. 91,000 men laid down their arms. Only 5,000 would ever return home. For the rest, Stalingrad would become their grave. Their names, their faces, their stories, lost beneath the snow, beneath history itself. Only their letters remained, and in those letters the truth of Stalingrad survives. Not the rhetoric of generals or dictators, but the voice of a man who, in his final hours, still believed that writing home meant he might live a little longer. In the next part of this story, we follow what came after. The surrender, the death marches into the east, and the few who lived to tell what Stalingrad truly meant. Morning broke on February 2nd, 1943, pale, brittle, and still. For the first time in 200 days, the guns were silent. The battle was over. The city that once bore Stalin's name had devoured an army. In the cellars and ruins, tens of thousands of German soldiers emerged slowly from the rubble. They were unrecognizable, bearded, starved, wrapped in rags torn from blankets and curtains. The proud gray uniforms of the Wehrmacht had turned the color of ash. Many carried no rifles, no helmets, not even boots. Across the white wasteland of Stalingrad, they walked toward Soviet lines with their hands raised. Some dragged the wounded on sleds made from doors. Others supported comrades barely conscious from hunger. A few still carried letters, folded carefully inside their tunics, as if paper could protect them. The Red Army soldiers who watched this spectacle did not cheer. They looked on in silence, astonished that these wrecks of men had once been the conquerors of Europe. One Soviet officer later wrote, "They looked at us with empty eyes. Not hatred, not fear, only emptiness. We could not rejoice. We pitied them." The German Sixth Army had ceased to exist. Of the 330,000 who had entered the Stalingrad pocket in November, more than half were already dead. 91,000 remained to surrender. Within months, almost all of them would be gone. In the final hours before capitulation, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus sat in the basement of the department store that had served as his headquarters. Around him, the walls shook with distant explosions. His officers waited for orders. Hitler's last message still echoed in their minds. Surrender is forbidden. But there was nothing left to command. When Soviet Major General Ivan Laskin arrived to demand his capitulation, Paulus looked up from his chair and simply said, "I have no army left." His aide described his face as the color of stone. The room was freezing. Their breath hung like smoke. At 7:35 that morning, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of Stalingrad. 2 days later, General Strecker surrendered the last troops in the north. The city, once a symbol of Hitler's ambition, was now a monument to his delusion. For the soldiers, surrender did not mean safety. The Red Army, though victorious, was exhausted and furious. Soviet civilians had suffered beyond imagination. Families slaughtered, entire districts burned. Mercy was rare. Columns of prisoners were formed and marched east. Those who could not stand were left behind. One Soviet correspondent wrote, "They walked in silence. From time to time, one fell into the snow and did not rise. The others stepped around him without looking. The march out of Stalingrad was a march through death. Temperatures dropped to -30. The men wore no gloves. Their breath froze on their faces like glass. At night, they slept in barns or open fields, pressed together for warmth. In the morning, half would not wake. In some groups, Soviet guards shared bread, a rare act of compassion in a war that had none. In others, prisoners were beaten, stripped, or shot for lagging behind. Most of the guards were barely older than their captives, boys hardened by years of invasion and starvation. To them, these men were not just enemies. They were reminders of burned villages and murdered families. Yet amid the suffering, small acts of humanity still flickered. A Russian nurse later recalled seeing one German soldier help carry another for miles through the snow, whispering prayers in his language she did not understand. When they both collapsed, she covered them with her coat until they stopped shivering. Among these columns might have been the soldier whose letter we heard before. the one found months later in a snowbank near the Volga. The letter, damp and crumpled, was recovered by a Soviet officer who could read German. He kept it in his coat pocket for years before handing it over to an archivist in Moscow. It now survives only as a fragment, a few sentences deciphered through time and decay. If the letter reaches you, then I am already far from here. Perhaps not alive, but I wish to believe that one day someone will understand what happened to us. In those words lies not defiance, but reflection. The faint voice of a man who understood that the truth of Stalingrad would not be told by generals, but by those who suffered beneath them. Back in Germany, news of the disaster was slow to emerge. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda issued bulletins of heroic resistance, calling Stalingrad a bulwark of European civilization against Bolshevism. Newspapers printed portraits of smiling soldiers under slogans like, "They fight to the last bullet." But the families of those men began to suspect otherwise. Weeks passed without letters. Mail stopped arriving. Telegrams bore only one phrase: missing on the Eastern Front. In small towns across Germany, mothers lit candles in church. Wives stood at train stations, hoping for returning trains that never came. The illusion of endless victory, built on the conquests of Poland, France, and Kiev, cracked and fell apart. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the defeat was called a necessary sacrifice. But among ordinary Germans, the word Stalingrad took on another meaning. Not heroism, but doom. The reality of that defeat, however, was far from over. The prisoners, now scattered across the Soviet Union, began the next chapter of their ordeal. They were sent to labor camps in Tambov, Siberia, and the Urals, places of frost and hunger, where the line between survival and death was thin as breath. The Soviet Union, itself broken and starving, could barely feed its own people. German prisoners received little more than scraps. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, all ran rampant. By the end of 1943, nearly 60,000 of the Stalingrad captives had perished. Only a few thousand remained alive by 1949. Those who survived would one day tell of the long marches through endless snow, of men who sang Christmas hymns with no strength left in their lungs, of the faces of comrades fading in the frost, and of the silence, always the silence, because in that silence, they remembered what they had written, what they had believed, and what they had lost. History remembers Stalingrad as a turning point, the moment when Nazi Germany began to fall. But for those who were there, it was something else entirely. It was where the machinery of empire met the limits of the human body and soul. The soldier's final letter, those few lines buried in the snow, was not written to glorify a cause. It was written to endure beyond it. In the next part of this story, we will follow what became of those who marched east, and the world they left behind in the ashes of Stalingrad. The march eastward from Stalingrad was not a retreat. It was an exodus, a procession of ghosts walking into the heart of winter. Behind them, the city burned in silence. Ahead, nothing but snow. They were the remnants of the German 6th Army, 91,000 soldiers, officers, medics, drivers, cooks. All that remained of the force that had once been called the spearhead of Hitler's destiny. Now they were prisoners, marching through the land they had invaded, through villages they themselves had destroyed months earlier. The temperature dropped below -30. The wind cut through their rags like knives. They had no gloves, no blankets, no proper shoes. Men wrapped their feet in strips of shirts, their heads in pieces of old curtains. Frostbite turned fingers black. Skin cracked, peeled, froze again. They walked in silence. Talking wasted energy, and breath hurt. Every kilometer, another man fell. The columns didn't stop for the dead. The living stepped around them and kept walking. The snow covered the fallen within hours. Those who survived the first days spoke later of the strange stillness of it. How sound vanished in the cold. How the world seemed empty except for the crunch of boots and the whisper of wind. One recalled, "We no longer thought of escape or of home. We thought only of the next step." Nothing else existed. It was not hatred that drove their guards, it was duty. The Red Army soldiers escorting them were barely older. Thin, exhausted, and hungry too. Some were Ukrainians or Central Asians, who had themselves seen their families die under German bombs. Others had lost everything but the rifle in their hands. When a prisoner stumbled, a guard would shout in Russian, "Bystri! Move!" Sometimes the man rose again. Sometimes he didn't. After days of walking, the first columns reached temporary holding points, the shattered outskirts of small towns. Barns turned into cages. The Soviets were overwhelmed. They had never expected so many prisoners. They had no supplies for them, no food, no doctors. The prisoners were simply left to endure. They slept on bare ground, pressed together like animals, feeding on snow and the memory of bread. Dysentery spread fast. The sick lay in the corners. The smell of death became part of the air. One Soviet medic later wrote in her journal, "We could not help them. There was no medicine, no bandages. They died quietly, whispering words in German. Some called for their mothers. Some sang to themselves." I remember one man. He died smiling. He said, "Zu Haus, home." Among these men, somewhere in the vast whiteness, was the soldier whose final letter would one day be found in the ruins near the Volga. The paper was folded into a pocket, soaked through with melted snow. His handwriting trembled but remained legible. It read, "I have seen men pray who never prayed before. I have seen courage without command, kindness without reason. Perhaps this is what remains when everything else is gone." No one knows if he survived the march. Perhaps he fell on the road. Perhaps he made it to one of the distant camps, only to die weeks later. But the words outlived him. They captured what few could describe: the moment when an army stopped being soldiers and became men again. By March 1943, tens of thousands of the prisoners had perished on the way east. Those who reached the camps were skeletons wrapped in rags. They no longer saluted. They no longer used rank. Generals slept beside privates, sharing what little food they could find. In one camp, near Tambov, survivors recalled digging graves in frozen soil with their hands because there were no tools. They buried the dead at dawn, before the next roll call. At night, they spoke quietly of home, of wives, of children, of the smell of forests after rain. A diary found decades later contained one line repeated over and over: "We will not be remembered, but maybe our words will." The Soviets, struggling to rebuild their own shattered country, had little to offer these prisoners. They were not executed. There was no need. Hunger, disease, and the cold would do what bullets could not. But something remarkable began to happen in the camps. As the months passed, hatred began to fade. Prisoners started to learn Russian words. Some Soviet guards shared cigarettes, a piece of bread, a handful of snow to melt for water. In those small gestures, both sides began to see something beyond vengeance. One Russian interpreter remembered a German officer who refused to eat his ration until a wounded comrade was fed. "He said nothing," she wrote, "but I saw tears on his face. I did not know Germans could cry." Back in Germany, the news had reached a stunned nation. For weeks, Hitler had forbidden mention of Stalingrad. Then, in early February, Joseph Goebbels appeared on the radio, his voice solemn. "The sacrifice of our heroes on the Volga will be the foundation of our final victory." But no one believed it. Across Germany, the word Stalingrad became a whisper of dread. Trains stopped bringing letters. Entire towns received lists of the missing. Churches filled with mothers and widows clutching photographs of men who would never come home. One woman wrote in her diary, "The postman comes and we all hold our breath. Every knock on the door is death." The myth of Nazi invincibility had ended. Not in a blaze of glory, but in a blizzard of silence. In the ruins of Stalingrad itself, Soviet soldiers continued to find remnants of the battle for months. Bones, helmets, diaries, scraps of paper half buried in ice. Among them was one letter sealed in a tin box. It was addressed simply, "To my family, if found." Inside, the writing was clear, measured, almost peaceful. "I do not write as a soldier now, but as a man. The war has taken everything from us, even the reason for fighting. But if anyone reads this, know that we once believed we were the victors. Now I know the victors will be those who survive." The paper was signed only with initials. No unit, no rank. Just a name, blurred by moisture, unreadable forever. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a revelation of what happens when ideology meets reality, when the machinery of war consumes the men who built it. The letter from that frozen soldier remains one of the few voices that reach us across the decades. Through his words, we see not monsters, but human beings caught in the cold machinery of fate. In the next part, we journey beyond the battlefield, into the Soviet camps, into the slow years of captivity, and into the memories of those who returned home to a Germany that no longer recognized the prisoners who survived the march east reached the Soviet labor camps in waves, half-starved columns of men delivered to a landscape of frost and silence. They arrived at places whose names they didn't know: Beketovka, Tambov, Krasnogorsk, Oranki, Suzdal, and Vorkuta. To most, it didn't matter where they were. They had already left the world behind. Inside the camps, winter ruled everything. The air smelled of coal smoke and sickness. Frost clung to the inside of the barracks, forming delicate patterns on the wood, a beauty cruel in its indifference. There were no mattresses, no blankets, only planks. The men slept side by side for warmth, their breath condensing into mist. They had come from Stalingrad, a city of death, but here they found a slower dying, one measured in hunger, in coughing fits, in the hollow rattle of tin bowls. The daily ration was a ladle of watery soup and a slice of bread no bigger than a hand. Some men saved crumbs for later, only to wake and find them gnawed away by rats. One prisoner, a German doctor, later wrote in his memoirs, "Our world had narrowed to three things: cold, hunger, and memory. Memory was the most dangerous, for it could drive you mad." The sick lay in the corners, shivering, their bodies swollen with edema. There was little medicine. Soviet doctors tried what they could, but they too had almost nothing. They worked among the dying with bandages torn from old uniforms. In one camp, survivors remembered being fed horse bones boiled 3 times over. The broth was gray and thin, but it kept them alive. And yet, amid that despair, life did not vanish entirely. Prisoners began to form small communities, not of rank, not of command, but of necessity. They divided food equally, tended to the sick, shared stories of home. Some began to teach each other languages. Others carved small crosses from bits of wood. One young soldier from Bavaria, once a mechanic, began to draw. Using coal from the stove, he sketched faces of those around him: hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, frost-bitten hands. Years later, those drawings would be found, hidden under floorboards, preserved as a record of humanity's endurance. Letters were forbidden, but the men wrote anyway. They scribbled words on scraps of paper, on the backs of official notices on birch bark. Some buried them under their bunks, others sewed them into their clothes, hoping one day they'd be found. One such letter, discovered in the Tambov archives decades later, read, "Mother, I am still alive, though I no longer feel I live. We no longer fight the Russians. We fight the cold. We fight the hunger. We fight the thought that we will never see you again." Outside the camps, the Soviet Union was rebuilding. Cities in ruins, families torn apart, millions dead. Resources were scarce. The Red Army itself was rationed. For many Russians, the sight of captured Germans stirred bitterness that words cannot describe. They remembered their own homes burned, their own children lost. The camps were harsh not only by design, but by circumstance. Yet not all who watched the prisoners saw enemies. Some guards and civilians pitied them. A Russian woman named Anna Grishina, who worked near a POW kitchen, later wrote in her diary, "They were so thin that when they lifted the pots, their hands trembled. One of them thanked me for water. In that moment, I saw not a German, but a man." The Soviet system of captivity was brutal, but it was not purely vengeful. Many prisoners were eventually assigned to rebuild what the war had destroyed. They worked in quarries, on railways, in factories. They hauled timber, built bridges, cleared mines, and raised cities from rubble. For every task completed, they received a piece of bread, sometimes a handful of sugar. Among them were former generals and professors, men who once commanded divisions, now reduced to laborers in frozen mud. In the camp, rank meant nothing. The past was gone. By the summer of 1943, Disease had swept through nearly every camp that held the Stalingrad survivors. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, the same afflictions that had killed them in the ruins of the Volga. Thousands died before the thaw. Their bodies were buried in mass graves, marked only by wooden stakes. But those who endured began to adapt. They learned to ration their energy, to survive on routine. They formed choirs, small orchestras using handmade instruments. They exchanged poems, pieces of Shakespeare, Goethe, and Heine, fragments remembered from school, whispered in the dark to keep language alive. It was during this time that the myth of Stalingrad began to change within the prisoners themselves. No longer was it a tale of honor or duty. It became something else, a lesson, a burden, a memory that refused to fade. One captured officer wrote secretly in his journal, smuggled out years later. At Stalingrad, we lost more than an army. We lost belief in the Führer, in destiny, in war. We entered the city as conquerors and left as men who had seen the end of all things. These writings passed from man to man, became a form of resistance, not against their captors, but against forgetting. They told each other stories to remember who they were before uniforms and orders, before hunger turned their faces into strangers. Winter turned to spring, then summer. The sun brought no comfort, only the stench of disease and the sight of shallow graves thawing from the ice. But there was movement now. Soviet interrogators visited the camps. They wanted names, details, ranks, and confessions. Many prisoners cooperated, others refused. A few joined anti-fascist committees, hoping cooperation might spare them. It was in this uncertain world, between survival and despair, that the legend of the last letter grew. Prisoners whispered about a message written by one of their own during the final hours in Stalingrad, said to capture everything they had lived and lost. Some claimed to have seen it, others said it was destroyed. But the idea of it, of a soldier's words surviving when he did not, became a kind of faith. One survivor later explained, "That letter was our prayer. We believed that as long as his words endured, some part of us might endure too." By late 1943, as the Red Army began to push westward across Ukraine, the prisoners realized the war was turning. They listened to the distant news through rumors carried by guards. Kursk, Smolensk, Kiev liberated. For the first time, they understood that Germany might lose. And in that realization came something unexpected, a kind of release. The war that had consumed their youth, their friends, their homeland, was ending even if they would not see it. One man wrote on the back of a ration slip, "When you have lost everything, there is freedom. We have nothing left to fear." The camps of 1943 were places of suffering, but also of reckoning. Here the men of Stalingrad faced not only the cold and hunger, but themselves. Their letters, their songs, their drawings became bridges between the living and the dead, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, the human spirit refuses silence. In the next part, we follow those who endured the years that followed, through war's end, captivity, and the long road home to a Germany that no longer knew their names. By 1944, a year after the surrender at Stalingrad, the German prisoners scattered across the Soviet Union were shadows of the men they once were. Fewer than 40,000 remained alive. The rest had vanished into snow, disease, or the quiet anonymity of mass graves marked by wooden stakes and frost. Yet for those still breathing, life had entered a strange rhythm, half captivity, half survival. The war continued beyond the barbed wire. They could sense it in the guards' faces, in the rare snippets of radio they overheard, in the shifting tone of Soviet interrogators. The Red Army was advancing west now, reclaiming the cities once lost. The front had turned. Inside the camps, this news arrived like the echo of a distant storm. Some prisoners greeted it with hope, believing a German defeat might finally end their torment. Others sank deeper into despair, knowing that every Soviet victory made them more expendable. In the camp at Tambov, the surviving officers still tried to hold order. Roll call at dawn, work details by day, a few hours of rest at night. But the illusion of rank had faded long ago. The general and the private shared the same shovel. the same bowl of thin soup, the same patch of cold floor. One survivor later wrote, "We no longer addressed each other by rank. We were brothers in misfortune, equal in the eyes of hunger. Work became the rhythm of existence. Prisoners hauled logs from forests, rebuilt railways, dug ditches through frozen earth. The Soviets needed labor, and the Germans supplied it. Each day they were given a task. Each night, a tally of the dead. Sometimes, when the guards weren't watching, the men would pause to rest and look up at the sky. In the north, they saw the aurora shimmer, a strange, ghostly green light moving like smoke. It reminded them of fire, of home, of the front lines where the world they knew had burned away. They spoke in whispers, sharing memories like contraband, the taste of beer, the sound of church bells, the smell of a bakery at dawn. Some still believed they would return home. Others stopped believing altogether. One man, once a teacher from Bremen, was asked by a comrade what he would do if he survived. He said simply, "Teach again. But this time, I will teach peace." Letters were still forbidden, but Soviet censors occasionally allowed brief messages, carefully controlled, translated, inspected. Most never reached Germany. Those that did were heavily edited. A typical note might read, "I am healthy, I work. Do not worry. We are treated well." Behind those few lines was another reality, one of fever, frostbite, and exhaustion. But sometimes, smuggled in the margins, a few dared to write more. One surviving scrap, preserved in an archive in Moscow, reads, "Mother, tell the children I am not lost. I am only far away. The sun still rises here, though we cannot see it. The handwriting trembles, the ink thinned with melted snow." By 1944, as Soviet victories mounted, Leningrad liberated, Belarus reclaimed, the prisoners began to notice a shift in their captors. Some guards who once glared at them with hatred now seemed indifferent. The war was too big, too long, revenge no longer satisfied. In some camps, guards even began to speak with the prisoners. They asked about Germany, about the war, about Hitler. The Germans in turn asked about families, about villages, about what remained of the world. Small fragments of humanity returned. One night, a Soviet soldier named Ivan offered a cigarette to a German mechanic who sat shivering outside a barrack. The mechanic hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. Ivan smiled, saying only, "My brother died in Leningrad. Maybe yours too. We are both still here." They smoked in silence, but the cruelty of the camps didn't vanish with compassion. Hunger still ruled. Disease still stalked. In one camp in the Urals, typhus swept through barracks, killing hundreds in days. The sick lay side by side, delirious, whispering fragments of prayers in different languages: German, Russian, Polish, Hungarian. A doctor, himself a prisoner, kept notes on scraps of paper hidden in his boot. Years later, his writings would be published in West Germany. He described one man delirious with fever, calling out the same words over and over: "Stalingrad, meine Liebe. Stalingrad, my love." The doctor wrote, "He was not mad. He was speaking to the city as if it were a woman, cruel, beautiful, and eternal." We all understood. In those years, the name Stalingrad became a kind of myth within the camps. It was whispered in half-sleep, muttered in delirium, carved into the wood of bunks. It was no longer the name of a place, but of an idea, a place where everything ended, and from which there was no return. And yet memory refused to die. Men who could no longer remember the faces of their comrades still remembered their words, and especially the letter. That single letter that had somehow become legend among the survivors. It was said to have been written by a young lieutenant in the final days of the battle, a message to his mother, found near his body when the snow melted. The Soviets kept it, and copies circulated secretly among prisoners. It read, "Do not mourn me. Tell father I understood too late. We came here believing we were heroes. But now I know the brave are those who endure, not those who destroy. If I never return, remember that I once believed I would." No one knew if the letter was real or a creation of hope, but it gave them something to believe in, a fragment of decency from the ruins. By 1945, When Berlin fell and Hitler shot himself in his bunker, the men in Soviet camps heard the news as if it came from another planet. Some wept, some laughed, others sat in silence. One prisoner wrote later, "We had marched east under his name. We had burned, killed, and died for it. And now he was gone, and we were still here. It was as if the shadow had lifted, and we could see ourselves for the first time." The war was over, but for them, captivity was not. Their guards told them they were no longer enemies, but criminals. They would not go home soon. They were to rebuild what they had destroyed: railways, bridges, factories, the empire of their conquerors. Each man carried a different kind of guilt. Some for what they had done, some for what they had believed, some for simply having survived when better men had not. And still the snow fell. In the ruins of post-war Europe, the men of Stalingrad lived on as shadows. Laborers, convicts, forgotten soldiers of a lost cause. Their survival was not celebrated, nor even acknowledged. But among them still passed whispers of one man's words. The letter frozen in his coat, written before the city fell. It was their reminder that even amid the wreckage of ideology and war, a spark of humanity could survive. A voice carried through snow, through silence, through time. In the next part, the war will end, but not the captivity. Years will pass. Some will return home to a Germany they no longer recognize. Others will vanish into the frost forever. The war had ended, but for the men of Stalingrad, the end meant nothing. The gunfire stopped. The hunger did not. The German Reich was gone. Berlin a ruin. Hitler dead in his bunker. And yet, here in the Soviet camps, the prisoners still lived by the rhythm of orders, shovels, and frost. In May 1945, when the news of Germany's surrender reached the camps, there was no celebration, no cheering, no tears of joy, just quiet. One survivor later wrote, "We did not know how to react. The war had ended for the world, but for us it had only changed its name. The Soviets now called them war criminals rather than prisoners of war." Each man was told he must atone through labor. It was a phrase repeated endlessly, a sentence without an end. They worked in the forests, the quarries, the factories. They hauled timber, built railways, and cleared rubble from bombed cities. For every brick lifted, a ration of bread. For every day missed, punishment. The weak collapsed in the fields. The stronger carried them until they couldn't anymore. The camp system had changed too. The Soviet Union, victorious but scarred, needed rebuilding. Millions of its own citizens were dead or displaced. Roads, bridges, entire cities lay in ruins. The German prisoners became a workforce for reconstruction, not out of mercy, but necessity. In the camp near Vorkuta, north of the Arctic Circle, the prisoners worked beneath skies that never darkened in summer and never brightened in winter. They lived in barracks that creaked under the weight of frost. Each morning began with the same ritual: the guard's whistle, the count, the slow march through the snow to the worksite. They carried logs thicker than their bodies, shoveled coal, and broke frozen earth with iron bars. The air smelled of sweat, blood, and kerosene. And always, the cold. The cold that crept through walls, through blankets, through skin and bone, until even dreams froze over. One man wrote years later, "We stopped feeling our fingers, our names, our past. Only hunger reminded us we were alive." And yet, there were small moments that defied the void. In one camp in the Urals, prisoners built a makeshift Christmas tree from pine branches and string. They sang Stille Nacht under their breath, afraid the guards would hear. A few Soviet sentries listened quietly, then turned away. That night, the prisoners shared their meager rations, a piece of bread, a handful of dried peas, as communion. Others began to write again. Now, with the war over, their captors allowed limited correspondence. The first letters went home since 1942. They were short, censored, translated, and sometimes rewritten, but they existed. One such letter, preserved in the archives of the German Red Cross, read, "Dear Mother, I am alive. I do not know how long I have been here, but I work, and I think often of home. Tell my little brother to plant a tree for me. If I return, I will sit beneath it. Many families never received these letters. Some had moved, some had been killed in bombings, others had simply given up hope. But for the men who wrote them, the act itself, the writing, became proof that they still existed. As months turned into years, the memory of Stalingrad refused to fade. The prisoners spoke of it endlessly, not as a battle, but as a presence that haunted every dream. It was the place where time had stopped for them, where they had lost everything that made them who they were. Some blamed Hitler, others blamed themselves. A few, still clinging to belief, spoke of fate, but most spoke of remorse. One former sergeant confessed in a letter to a Soviet guard who had befriended him, "When we came here, we thought we were strong. We thought Russia would kneel. Instead, we were broken. Not by your bullets, but by what we saw. We became the thing we once feared. Forgotten." The guard kept that letter until his death. He said later, "That was the first German I met who spoke like a human being, not a soldier." For the Soviet people, these men were a strange sight. The faces of an enemy now powerless, trudging through their ruined cities to rebuild them. In Stalingrad itself, now beginning to rise again from the ashes, German POWs worked under the watch of the same people whose homes they had once destroyed. A Russian woman who survived the siege recalled watching them lay bricks along the Volga. They were thin, silent, moving like ghosts. Some cried when they saw the graves. I could not hate them anymore. I had no strength left for hate. This uneasy coexistence of victims and former invaders became one of the strangest legacies of Stalingrad. The city that had consumed an army now used its remnants to rebuild itself. By 1946, fewer than 10,000 of the Stalingrad prisoners were still alive. The rest had perished in captivity. Those who remained were scattered across hundreds of camps. They became known as the Long Shadows of the Volga. Among them were men who would later write the books, the diaries, and the testimonies that the world would come to know. Heinrich Gerlach's Breakout at Stalingrad, Arno Surminsky's accounts, and the haunting collection Last Letters from Stalingrad. It was from these fragments, from memory and ink, that the world began to understand the human cost of that battle. But even as they wrote, as they survived, many still clung to one image, a single letter, frozen in the ruins, written by one of their own in the last hours of the siege. No one could say who the author was. Some said a lieutenant, others a private. It didn't matter. His words had become the voice of them all. If these words outlive me, let them be my return. I go now into the snow, but my thoughts remain with you. Do not weep for me, for I am already part of this land. For the prisoners, those words meant more than orders, more than survival. They meant meaning. They had been soldiers of empire. Now they were witnesses of its ruin. By the late 1940s, whispers of release began to spread. Some camps received orders to prepare lists of names. Others were told to move prisoners west. Hope, fragile and dangerous, flickered again. One man described it simply: "We began to dream in color again." But the wait would last years more. For many, the return home would not come until a decade after Stalingrad's fall. The world had rebuilt itself. Nations had moved on. Yet the men of Stalingrad remained trapped, not just behind barbed wire, but in memory. Their story was not finished. Their letters still waited to be read. Their homecomings, when they finally came, would be both miracles and tragedies. The return of men to a country that no longer knew them. By the end of the 1940s, the world had changed beyond recognition. The war that had devoured Europe was history now, a subject for politicians and parades. But for the men of Stalingrad, history had not yet ended. They were still living inside it. From the forests of Siberia to the labor camps of Kazakhstan, scattered across a continent they once tried to conquer, the last survivors of the German Sixth Army waited. For some, it had been 6 years since the surrender. For others, nearly 10. Time had become meaningless. They no longer called themselves prisoners of war. They called themselves Heimkehrer, those who still hoped to return home. In 1947, the first small groups were released: wounded men, the sick, and those the Soviets believed could no longer work. They boarded trains headed west, not knowing whether home still existed. Most of them were unrecognizable, skeletal, gray-haired, with eyes too old for their years. At railway stations across the Soviet Union, crowds gathered to watch them pass. Some Soviet civilians waved, others turned away. One Russian witness remembered, "They looked like walking bones. I could not imagine they had once been our enemies. They were just men." The war crimes trials had begun in Nuremberg. The world was learning about the horrors unleashed in the name of the Reich. The men in Soviet captivity heard rumors of concentration camps, of millions dead. Many refused to believe it. Others wept. A prisoner in a camp near Moscow wrote in his secret diary, "We thought we were the victims. Now I am not sure. If this is the price of our blindness, it is just." Among the captives, guilt was a constant companion. Some carried it like a wound. Others denied it, clinging to old excuses. But all felt the weight of Stalingrad, the city that had broken them, and in breaking them, revealed who they were. Life in the camps had softened slightly by then. There was more food, more freedom to move, even newspapers, heavily censored but filled with glimpses of the outside world. The prisoners learned of atomic bombs, of new nations rising, of Germany divided between East and West. The men from Stalingrad were not returning to the country they had left. They were returning to two nations, each claiming to be the real Germany. Some feared they would never fit into either. One officer wrote in 1948, "When we left home, we were young men of the Reich. When we return, we will be old men of no nation." The Soviets began using the prisoners for propaganda. A group of German officers formed the National Committee for a Free Germany, denouncing Hitler and calling for reconciliation between Germans and Russians. Many joined not from conviction, but from hunger. Cooperation meant better rations, lighter work. But for some, it was sincere. They had seen too much to believe in the old slogans anymore. They dreamed of rebuilding a Germany without hatred. In a rare photograph from that period, a group of emaciated men stands before a banner that reads, "Nie wieder Krieg," never again war. Their faces are blank, their uniforms replaced with patched rags, yet the message is clear. At night in the barracks, they still spoke of home. They described it to one another in whispers, the smell of hay in summer, the ringing of church bells on Sunday, the sound of children's laughter. They described streets they could no longer remember clearly, mothers who might no longer be alive. And they spoke of the letter. Always someone mentioned it. The last letter from Stalingrad, the message that had somehow outlived its author. It had become more than a story. It was a kind of shared memory, passed between survivors like a prayer. One version said it ended with the words, "If these lines reach you, I am already gone. But know this, I do not regret living, only believing too late." By 1949, new political winds were blowing. Stalin's health was failing. The Soviet Union, weary of war and burdened by its own reconstruction, began to reconsider its prisoners. The Western powers were pressing for their release. Then slowly, the list began. Names checked, signatures taken, numbers written on boards, train tickets to the West. The long wait was ending. But not everyone would go home. For many, the graveyard of Russia was final. Tens of thousands had died nameless, buried beneath snow and numbers. For them, there would be no homecoming, no graveside prayers, only silence. In 1950, the first major transports of surviving German POWs began returning to East Germany. They came back in small groups, stepping down from trains that hissed with steam. Crowds waited at the stations. Wives, children, old parents who had not seen them since before the invasion of the Soviet Union. Witnesses described the reunions as both joyful and unbearable. A child who had been told her father was dead now met an old man she didn't recognize. A wife fainted upon seeing her husband, who weighed barely 45 kilograms. Some soldiers wept in silence. Others could not speak at all. One woman later wrote in her diary, "They returned from another world. Their eyes looked at us, but they were still there, in the snow, in Stalingrad." Those who returned found a country that no longer understood their suffering. In West Germany, the men of Stalingrad were treated with suspicion. Reminders of a war everyone wanted to forget. In East Germany, they were used as symbols of anti-fascist re-education. In both, they struggled to belong. A returned officer wrote bitterly, "We were heroes when we marched east. We were ghosts when we came back. Many could not adapt. Some never spoke of their years in captivity. Others wrote, not to be understood, but to be remembered. Their memoirs, letters, and interviews would become the true memorials of Stalingrad, not of glory, but of warning." In 1955, 12 years after the surrender, the last survivors of the Stalingrad army finally returned home. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's visit to Moscow had secured their release. The trains arrived to cheering crowds, cameras flashing. Newspapers called it the return of the forgotten. But those men stepped onto German soil not as soldiers, not as victors, but as witnesses. They had seen the cost of obedience, the futility of conquest, and the slow death of belief. One of them, interviewed by a journalist, said only, "We learned that courage without conscience is nothing." The story of Stalingrad did not end in 1943, or 1945, or even 1955. It lives on in the letters, the memories, and the eyes of those who survived it. Through them, the dead still speak. The soldier whose last letter was frozen in the ruins. The millions who vanished in the snow. The city that refused to die. In the next part, we return to that city, to Stalingrad itself, reborn from ashes, and to the legacy that the battle left on both nations and on humanity itself. The war ended long ago, but Stalingrad never truly slept. The city that devoured an army became a symbol of resilience, of tragedy, of endurance beyond reason. By the 1950s, its ruins had been cleared, its wounds covered with concrete and steel. Where factories once burned, cranes now turned. Children played in streets built over mass graves. The new city was given the same name, Stalingrad, as if to remind the world that it had risen again. But beneath its foundations lay the bones of nearly 2 million people, soldiers of two empires, civilians who had never held a gun, all buried in the same frozen earth. Every time the city built a road or dug a foundation, bones appeared, fragments of helmets, boots, rusted dog tags. No one could walk its streets without stepping over history. In the early years of Reconstruction, the Soviet Union turned Stalingrad into a living monument. It was the city that had broken Hitler, the turning point of the Great Patriotic War. Propaganda posters showed brave defenders standing in flames. Statues rose where tanks had burned. The people who survived the siege were called the Iron Generation. But for those who remembered the real battle, the truth was quieter, heavier. The veterans who had lived through the siege carried their own scars. The hunger, the sound of walls collapsing, the smell of the Volga in winter. A Soviet nurse who had tended to the wounded in the ruins of the Red October factory later said, "We rebuilt the city, yes, but we never left that winter. It still lives inside us." In 1961, the name of the city changed. Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign swept across the USSR, erasing the dictator's name from towns, factories, and institutions. Stalingrad became Volgograd, but the memory refused to fade. For Russians, it would always be Stalingrad, the place where the tide of history turned. That same year, construction began on what would become one of the largest war memorials in the world, Mamayev Kurgan. It was built on the hill that had been fought over more fiercely than any other ground in the city. Thousands of men died here for a few meters of earth. Soviet and German dead were buried so densely that even after the war, soldiers' bones still surfaced in spring thaw. Now, cranes and bulldozers worked the same soil to raise a monument that would tower over the Volga, a stone figure of a woman striding forward with a sword in her hand. She was called Rodina Mat Zoviot, the Motherland Calls. When the monument was unveiled in 1967, veterans from both sides wept. The statue stood 70 meters tall, her face fierce, her gesture both grief and defiance. Beneath her feet lay the graves of 35,000 Soviet soldiers. Visitors from around the world came to see her, to stand in the shadow of her sword, to hear the echo of footsteps across the marble halls that lined the memorial's approach. And there, in the eternal flame chamber, among the inscriptions carved in red stone, are words that could have been written by anyone, Soviet or German, soldier or civilian. For those who stood here, death was no stranger. They met it not with fear, but with the hope that others might live in post-war Germany. The word Stalingrad became something different. Not victory, but warning. The first books, diaries, and letters began to be published in the 1950s, often secretly, often heavily censored. Among them was the haunting collection Letzte Briefe aus Stalingrad, Last Letters from Stalingrad. It appeared first in the West in 1950, claiming to be a compilation of genuine letters intercepted by the German field post during the battle. Historians would later argue about its authenticity. Some letters were real, others likely edited or reconstructed, but the emotion within them was true. The letters spoke not of triumph, but of realization, the moment when ideology dissolved and humanity returned. One wrote, "Mother, I am no hero. I am tired and hungry, and I only wish to see the fields again. Tell the children that the war is not as they say. It is not courage. It is suffering." Another, "When the end comes, think of me as a man who understood too late." These words spread through Germany like a quiet confession. For a generation raised on myths of glory and sacrifice, they offered something far more painful: truth. In both East and West Germany, the memory of Stalingrad became a mirror for national guilt. In the East, it was taught as proof of anti-fascist victory, the triumph of the Soviet people over fascist aggression. In the West, it became a wound, a tragedy to be studied but not glorified. But for the soldiers who had been there, for the mothers who still waited for sons who never returned, it remained something else, a personal reckoning. In letters sent decades after their release, veterans tried to explain it to their families. One wrote to his grandson in 1972, "When you read in your books that Stalingrad was a battle, remember, it was not a battle, it was an ending. Everything that came before died there. Everything after began there. The city itself carried that dual memory. Volgograd became a place of pilgrimage for Russians, for Germans, for anyone seeking to understand the price of war. Every February, survivors gathered at Mamayev Kurgan. Old soldiers in fading uniforms laid wreaths, stood in silence, and saluted ghosts. One Soviet veteran, his voice trembling, said to a visiting German journalist, 'When we thought only of killing you. Now when I look at you, I see my brother.' The journalist, himself a former soldier, wept. And beneath the memorial, in the earth of the hill, excavation teams continued to find traces of the battle. Helmets, medals, children's toys, diaries sealed in tins. One discovery made in 1975 captured headlines across Europe. It was a letter, a German soldier's, found in a rusted metal box buried beneath a collapsed trench near the Red October factory. The handwriting was still legible. It read, "If I do not return, tell those who live after us to remember that we too were human and that we knew it at the end." The letter was sent to Germany, identified only by initials, HR. The man's family could never be found, but the words joined the growing chorus of voices that Stalingrad refused to silence. The city was rebuilt, renamed, reborn. But the story of Stalingrad lives on not in stone or marble, but in words. In letters written with frozen hands, in diaries buried in snow, in the memory of a soldier who, at the end of all things, still wrote home. In the next part, we will journey into those words themselves, the letters that survived the siege, the voices that rose from the ruins, and what they tell us about the human heart beneath the machinery of war. Before the end, before the snow sealed everything in silence, the soldiers of Stalingrad wrote. They wrote because it was the only thing left that still felt human. When the bombs fell and the ground burned beneath them, when comrades froze beside them, when food was gone, they still found the strength to hold a pencil, to put thought to paper. These letters, collected over decades, are not official documents. They are fragments of souls, torn, smudged, but still alive. Together they form a mosaic of a generation that watched its own faith collapse under fire. One of the earliest recovered letters came from a 19-year-old infantryman named Otto, written on the night of January 30th, 1943, just 3 days before the surrender. It reads, "Dearest Mother, the candle is small. The wind comes through the cracks. Around me the men sleep. They look like old men now, though none of us are. The Russians have surrounded us completely. We wait. We no longer speak of rescue. We know. I dream of home, of the tree by our window, of your bread. I am not afraid anymore, only tired." The letter never reached his family. It was found in a burned-out building after the battle. For years, it was assumed he had died in captivity. But in 1962, historians found his name among lists of those buried near Mamiev Kurgan. His letter became part of Letzte Briefe aus Stalingrad. Another, from a young lieutenant named Karl, carries the voice of a man confronting the collapse of everything he believed. "We were told we came here to save Europe from Bolshevism. But as I sit in this ruin, I wonder what we are saving it for. There is no Europe here, only the end of men. The Russians fight with the fury of those defending their homes. We fight because we are told to. I no longer understand the difference between courage and madness." Karl's body was never identified. The letter was discovered folded inside a helmet encased in ice. These letters are raw, unedited, snapshots of a moment when obedience faltered and conscience awoke. Not all the letters were addressed to families. Some were written to friends, some to fiancés, some to no one at all. Words meant for a world that might never read them. One anonymous note, found near the Red October factory, reads, "I write these lines for whoever finds them. Do not think we were all the same. Some of us saw what was happening. Some of us tried to help the wounded, even the Russians. The war took everything from us, but I pray it will not take memory. Please remember that we once existed." That note, preserved in a Soviet archive, is believed to have been written in the last week of January 1943, just days before the final collapse. There are also letters from the other side, from Soviet soldiers defending their city. They too wrote home amid the ruins. One private, a 22-year-old named Sergei, wrote to his wife, "My love, we fight among the stones now. Every wall, every house is a battle. The Germans are strong, but they do not see what we see. Our homes, our people, our dead. I no longer fight for orders, but for you and for the street where our child played. If I fall, know that I did not fall for nothing." Sergei died 2 days later. His letter was found by his comrades and delivered to his wife after the war. She kept it for 60 years. Each letter is a heartbeat from the edge of extinction. Together they reveal something history books cannot, that even in the furnace of ideology, even when men are ordered to kill, the voice that whispers homeward does not die. One historian, reading through a stack of these notes in the 1970s, wrote in his journal, "It is strange. After a lifetime of studying battles and strategies, I realized here that the real front line is inside these letters, between faith and truth, between belief and doubt. The myth of last letters from Stalingrad has endured because it touches something universal. The moment when men stop being symbols and become human again. When we read their words, we feel their fear, their longing, their exhaustion, and their awakening." A final fragment, one of the most haunting, comes from an unknown corporal. His note, written in pencil, faded by water, ends with, "The snow is falling again. Soon it will cover us. I do not think we will last another night. But if I could ask for one thing, it would be that someone, someday, will read this and understand that we were not monsters. We were just men who went too far. The Soviets who found that note preserved it." A translator later wrote beside it, in Russian, "He writes like one of ours." Across both nations, in Germany and in Russia, these letters became sacred, not in the religious sense, but as a kind of secular scripture. They spoke to what war truly does to the human spirit. In East Germany, copies of last letters from Stalingrad were passed secretly from reader to reader, sometimes banned for being defeatist. In West Germany, students studied them as documents of moral awakening. In Russia, veterans read them aloud at commemorations, as proof that even enemies could be human. One Soviet general visiting West Germany in 1965 was asked what he thought when he first saw those German letters. He paused, then said, "When I read them, I realized that we had all fought the same battle, not against each other, but against despair." Time has weathered the paper, but the ink remains. The handwriting of the long-dead soldier still loops across the page as if freshly written, each word a defiance of oblivion. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the scratching of his pen beneath the roar of distant guns, the breath of the man who wrote with frost-bitten hands, the whisper that outlasted empires. If these words reach you, he wrote, know that I thought of you when all the world was falling apart. And somehow they did reach us. 80 years later, across nations, across generations, across silence. The last letter from Stalingrad is not just a relic of a single war, it is a mirror. It shows us what remains when all illusions are stripped away, when the noise of history fades and the quiet truth of the human heart is all that's left. But there is one final chapter to this story, not written in ink, but in the way Stalingrad lives on today. In the next part, we return to the city, to the descendants of those who fought, and to the legacy of that frozen letter, what it means in a world still haunted by war. 80 years have passed since the guns fell silent at Stalingrad. The ruins have become streets, the trenches have become gardens, and the ashes of war now lie beneath the roots of trees. Yet the echoes remain. Every February, the city pauses. Bells ring. Veterans and their families gather at Mamayev Kurgan, where the eternal flame burns day and night. Some are too old to walk. Others come carrying the portraits of men they never met. Grandfathers, brothers, sons. On those days, the past feels very near. The cold wind across the Volga feels the same as it did in 1943. And the people of Volgograd remember not only victory, but the price of it. Stalingrad was not only a Soviet victory, it was a human tragedy on both sides. It reminds us that ideology can destroy, but memory can heal. The letters, the diaries, they give faces to the numbers. Without them, it is only statistics. With them, it is life in Germany. The word Stalingrad still carries a special weight. Not of shame, not even of defeat, but of reflection. Every German schoolchild learns its story, not as propaganda, but as warning. It is the moment where the myth of invincibility shattered, and a generation saw what blind faith could create. At memorials across Germany, small plaques bear the same inscription found on a Stalingrad relic. Wir wollten leben und wir starben. We wanted to live and we died. Each year, delegations from Germany visit Volgograd. They walk the same ground where their grandfathers fell, lay flowers at the Soviet graves, and stand beside Russian veterans in silence. There are no flags, no speeches, only a shared understanding that in Stalingrad, both sides lost something no victory could restore. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, a small ceremony was held in Volgograd. Among the visitors was the son of a German soldier who had died in Stalingrad. He brought with him a copy of his father's last letter, the one that had been found decades earlier, frozen in the ruins. Standing before the eternal flame, he read aloud, "If I never return, know that I think of you not with fear, but with peace. The snow is falling. It is beautiful here, even now." When he finished, an old Russian woman, a survivor of the siege, stepped forward. She placed her hand on his arm and whispered, "He was young. So were we all." Then they stood together in silence as the wind moved over the hill. Today, Volgograd is a city of more than 1 million people. Its streets are alive, its skyline bright. But beneath the rhythm of modern life runs a quiet current of memory. When new construction begins, workers still find remnants of the war. Helmets, dog tags, bones, letters sealed in bottles. The city's museums catalog them carefully, each one a fragment of the story that refuses to die. In one museum display, under glass, lies a piece of paper, yellowed, fragile, the edges eaten by time. The handwriting is faint but still legible. It is the letter that inspired this story. The label beside it reads, "Recovered 1947, found near the Red October factory. Author unknown." The words inside are simple. February 2nd, 1943. Dearest family, if you read this, then I am gone. Do not grieve. I am no longer afraid. The snow falls quietly. The battle is ending. Perhaps it is right that it ends here. Tell the world that we once lived, and that in our last hour, we remembered love. There is no signature, no rank, no regiment, just humanity, frozen in ink. That letter has traveled the world. It has been displayed in museums in Berlin, Moscow, London, Tokyo. It has been read aloud in classrooms, documentaries, and memorials. For millions, it speaks not of nations or armies, but of what war takes from us and what it cannot destroy. Because beyond ideology, beyond victory and defeat, beyond even death itself, one truth remains, that a single human voice, whispering through time, can still reach across the ages and remind us what it means to feel, to hope, to remember. The frozen soldier of Stalingrad never made it home, but his words did. They traveled further than any army, endured longer than any empire, and found their way to us. Here, now, in a world still learning the lessons he wrote with his final breath. And so we listen, because every time we read his letter, we promise, silently, humbly, that we will not let it happen again. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.